Hey everyone, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. Today we're going to be talking about psychic distance. So I put up a poll on my channel asking what videos you wanted me to make and for me to talk about. One of the options was psychic distance, which is something I've been wanting to talk about for a while because I have an old blog post on it and your girl loves taking old blog posts and making them into videos because I have all the points already scripted out in a coherent manner. And a lot of people commented saying that they didn't know what psychic distance was, and I thought that that meant it would be a great term to cover and a great topic to touch on because it's one of the most useful things I've learned in my whole writing degree. Anyone who studied writing academically is probably pretty familiar with the term. And it's pretty helpful stuff. It's a good one to know. So first of all, what is it? Because a lot of people said they didn't know. So psychic distance is how close or far the narrator or the narrative is from the character, and therefore how close or far the reader feels to the character. So with a close psychic distance, your narrator and your character are completely merged. That would be like a close first person, and with the farthest psychic distance you could have would be an objective third person, so the narrator and the character are completely separate entities. And then of course you have a huge range of possibilities, basically infinite, in between those 2 points. So why is this important? Basically, if you don't know what psychic distance is, you could be inadvertently pulling your psychic distance out when you don't want to. You could have drastic jumps between psychic distance that are really jarring. You want to be in control of your psychic distance because a lot of times new writers struggle with psychic distance being too far because they're just not really considering it, and when the psychic distance is too far it can be really hard for the reader to connect to the character because we're not really getting access to the character in an intimate way. So the closer your psychic distance is, the more intimate the narrator is. You could also see it as the closer the psychic distance, the more subjective the narrative is, and the farther, the more objective. That's why the farthest psychic distance you can have is a straight up objective point of view, which barely and nothing is written in an objective point of view, but it's where the narrator doesn't even have access to the character's thought and is only watching. I did a little example. This is kind of in the same format as the examples I would always get in school, but I just wrote this one myself. So I'm gonna read 5 different sentences and each one is the same sentence but just closer. So first of all is, it's 2019 and a man is walking his dog in the rain. This is really objective. Nothing about this is really debatable. It's 2019, that's a fact, and the man is walking a dog in the rain. Like, it's just completely objective. Nothing about that is really intimate. We have no access to his thoughts. We're just seeing him. So second up to that would be Sal Birkins led his retriever into the storm. So now we've named him, so it's a little more intimate because we know who the character is. And same, we've specified the dog, so things are getting a little more specific and we're just a little closer. It's still pretty objective though. It's still pretty distant. Next up, kind of a middle ground, kind of almost a standard third person. Sal hated the rain, but his dog didn't seem to care. So now it's getting more subjective because now we have some emotions and opinions. He hated the rain, that's a subjective opinion, it's not objective. It's something that we have to have access to his thoughts to know. Same about his dog. His dog didn't seem to care. Here he's making an assumption about his dog, so we're starting to get more into his brain. One closer would be, damn, Sal hated this weather. So now it's starting to get voicier. We use the word damn, so we're more in his head. We're hearing his unique language. It's subjective. He hates the weather. And then finally, a very close psychic distance would be, frigid water drips down my nose, but Goldie doesn't seem to care. So as you can see now, it's subjective and we're totally in his head. It's first person. Those are some examples of psychic distance zooming in. And generally the rule of thumb is the farthest you can ever be is what you start with. So if you start really close, you can't really get farther. But if you start really far, you can zoom in. The goal of psychic distance isn't necessarily to have the closest psychic distance all the time. Even in just a regular narrative, it's going to change because sometimes you're going to state something that's a more objective fact and then next you're going to state something that's more subjective, and that's a difference in psychic distance. But what you don't want is for it to be farther than you're intending, and what you also don't want is for there to be jarring skips in psychic distance. So within the same piece, you can shift the psychic distance in and out. You don't want a jarring leap of psychic distance. That can really interrupt the flow of the writing. So for example, frigid water drips down his nose, but Goldie doesn't seem to care. It's 2019, a man walks his dog in the rain. We've started really intimately and then suddenly gone farther out, and it's quite jarring, especially when you're in the middle of a longer piece and you're kind of immersed in it, and then suddenly there's a really big skip in psychic distance. The bulk of this video, I'm going to talk about psychic distance in different point of views and what that looks like, but I wanted to start by talking about things that pull out the psychic distance. A lot of these tend to happen in third person, and first person is, I mean, it's closer. It's a closer psychic distance than third person. You can get very close in third person, but you can't really get as close as first, because psychic distance is how close the narrative is to the character, and with first person, the narrative is the character. So first person is as close as you can go. However, that doesn't mean that you can't make some of these errors in first person. These errors can all still happen in first person, and they can actually be quite jarring in first person and really weaken the point of view because they're things that are distancing a point of view that's trying to be inherently close. Here are some things that distance your point of view. The first one is referring to your character in a distant way. If we look at the example, when we got closer, we gave the character a name. We named him Sal. I don't know why I named him Sal. That was just the name that came to my mind. It would be weird if we named him and then later on we refer to him as the man, like we did in the first sentence. One I see people do a lot that's kind of a jarring point of view shift is refer to their character by like a title. Let's say that Sal's job was that he's a mailman, so referring to him as the mailman, or the tall man or something. That's really, really distant, because Sal isn't thinking of himself in that way. I'm not thinking of myself as like the YouTuber or the writer in my own narrative. That's really weird, that's really distant. Only an objective point of view is really seeing me that way or seeing Sal this way. Sal is thinking of himself as I, or he knows himself as Sal. That's one that I see people do a lot, especially new writers, I think, because people worry that they're overusing a pronoun or overusing their character's name, but really it's best to avoid those because they're super, super distant and it can be kind of jarring because people don't think of themselves in that way. So unless your point of view is really objective, doesn't really make sense, especially if you're jumping back and forth. So if I refer to Sal as Sal in one sentence and he in the next sentence, which that's fine, that's equally as close, and then in the next sentence I refer to him as the mailman. That would be a big psychic distance shift. So that's the first thing that shifts your psychic distance, is how you refer to your character. Of course, in first person, you're pretty much always referring to, your character's always referring to themselves as I, but another thing that can pull out the psychic distance are filters. I have an entire video on filters. I will leave a link to that in the cards. It's another really useful, easy writing hack that you can implement. Filters are essentially, is kind of when you put a little wedge between the character and their experience. To keep using the example that I've been using, Sal heard rain hitting the pavement. Heard is a filter here, so what that sentence could be instead would just be rain hit the pavement. Because we're in Sal's point of view, we know that anything stated in the narrative, Sal is experiencing. So we don't have to be told that he's hearing it. I go more into this in my video, so I won't really rehash filters now, but they do distance the psychic distance, and they're a pretty easy fix as well. Another thing that distances the psychic distance, and this one can be really jarring, is showing things the protagonist doesn't know or wouldn't think. This happens a lot in third person, pretty easy mistakes to make. Sometimes it can veer into head hopping. For example, you mention something that's happening in another room that your character doesn't know about, or something your character just wouldn't think. That distances your point of view. You see this a lot in omniscient point of views, where it's done purposefully. A great example of this is in the book Thief. The narrator here is an omniscient narrator, and he frequently states things that the characters don't know. Because our narrator is omniscient, it works here. But let's say we were writing in a close third limited and we started stating things that the characters wouldn't think or don't know. That really distances the point of view, and it's quite jarring, and that's kind of a point of view error a lot of the time. If you're writing in a limited point of view, you kind of have to commit to that character's perspective and only show things that are within their experience. I talk about this in my video on third person, but there is kind of a common misconception that in third person the narrator is not the character. The narrator is still very intricately tied to the character in third person. It's kind of just like a vessel that is attached to the character and is seeing and experiencing what the character experiences. So the next one, this is kind of related to the first point, but showing the character from an external viewpoint, or the character talking about themselves in a way that they wouldn't think about themselves. Looking at your character in a way that isn't how they perceive themselves. So similarly, like, it's like I said, referring to yourself as the mailman, but even things that your character wouldn't notice about themselves, like if they describe like what their hair looks like from the back, they don't know that. So let's say your character is walking down the street and they have some toilet paper stuck to their shoe. Kind of embarrassing, but they don't know that there's toilet paper stuck to their shoe, but the narrative mentions it. That's something the character doesn't know, so it's distancing the psychic distance because now your narrator's looking at the character rather than being the character. You can show that once the character realizes it, but at this point, in a limited point of view, your character doesn't know that. An omniscient narrator would know this, an objective narrator would know this, but a limited narrator or a first-person narrator would not. The next thing would be using vocabulary or phrasing your character would not. If you want a close psychic distance, keep in mind words and phrasing and images that your character would know and use. I think if you want more on this, it would be helpful to check out my video on voice. The next thing that can distance your point of view is direct thoughts. So direct thoughts are when you're writing, I mean, people do this a lot in third person. I used to do it all the time. My first book I wrote in third person, so many direct thoughts, it kills me. So direct thought is when you have a third person narrative and then there are first person thoughts, and they're often written in italics, or the thought will be in first person and it will say he thought, and he thought's being used as a filter. So for example, a direct thought would be, I hate this weather, Sal thought, and stared out the window. A way of phrasing that would have been more eloquent and smoothly integrated would be, he hated the weather, Sal stared out the window. Basically, when you put a thought in first person in your third person narrative, it's not technically incorrect, but it's really drawing attention to the fact that there is a narrator. And it's a really jarring shift in psychic distances because suddenly you're super close. Anytime you draw attention to the fact that the narrator is separate from the character, you are increasing the psychic distance. I would suggest just avoiding direct thoughts, basically always, unless it's like a really, like, you have a really strong reason for it. Like a book that uses direct thoughts as part of the style distinctly. It's a bad book, don't read it. My Absolute Darling by Gabriel Talent. Read that recently. I really didn't like it for reasons that I won't get into. But in that book, it's in third person, but the third person narrator is inherently separate from the main character. And it was a case where it was done very purposely because any time the main character thought something, her thoughts were so aggressive and vulgar that they would be separated and we would be told with a filter that she was thinking. And then the narrative itself was much more low-key and mellow and floral and not really reflecting her worldview at all. So that's a case where it was done very purposefully to kind of separate the character from the narrative. A lot of the time, if you want your psychic distance to be close and seamless, you don't want to be using direct thoughts. Another thing that distances your point of view is withholding. Withholding emotions, judgments, sensory detail, or just withholding the character's point of view. The less you let your character's emotions and thoughts seep into the narrative and color the narrative, the more distant your point of view can be. This is one reason why a lot of the time people feel less connected to characters in third person, because the third person is done with a lot of withholding. If you're in third person and you're really conservative about what you share that comes directly from the character's mind, your point of view can feel very distant because there's nothing subjective in it, and the more subjective, the closer we are. So don't be afraid to withhold your character's feelings, your character's thoughts, and also sensory detail that they're experiencing. You know, if it's cold, let them feel that. If it's raining, instead of just saying that it's raining, let us feel the water, like we had in this example, the character feeling the water dripping down their nose. This really just comes back to let your character's personality seep into the narrative. That will make your point of view closer and more voicey, and probably more interesting. So now let's talk about psychic distance in different point of views and what it looks like, because it does look different in different point of views. So let's start with first person because it's kind of the easiest. In first person, you're inherently really darn close because your narrator is the character. Now, some people say that in third person you can get as close as you can in first person. I disagree with that. I think you can get almost as close, but I don't think you can ever be as close in third person as first person because inherently first person, that's what first person is. Now, again, closer isn't always better, and sometimes you want that distance, and that's when third person is really, really useful, when you want that just sliver of distance or the ability to control distance a little more. With first person, you're inherently going to be right in their head, and for some characters that doesn't really work well. So as you can see, first person is really simple. The narrator is the character. There's no distance at all. Anything that's written on the page, we can assume as the reader is coming directly from the character. There's never really a question about it. All the things I mentioned you should still consider because they can create kind of flaws in your voice or can be kind of technical bumps, but you're inherently pretty darn close. With second person, it's hard to say exactly where second person fits into this. Some people say second person is closer. Some people say it's a little farther, but it's very close to writing in first person. The psychic distance is almost the same, and second person is kind of written in a technical matter very similarly to first person. So yeah, that's first person, pretty simple. If you want to check out my video on writing first person, I do have a video on that. It's kind of old. I haven't looked at it in a long time. I hope it's decent. So then let's talk about third person objective. Now, this is more just to illustrate the point of this video because no one really writes in third person objective. I can't remember the last time I read something that was in an objective point of view. Probably never happens in novels, maybe in short stories every once in a while, but I never see it. Third person objective means that your narrator is a camera. They have zero access to the character's mind. They're just kind of following them around like a camera. So as you can see, the narrator is completely separate from the protagonist. This psychic distance is really far. It was like in my first example where we could only ever state objective facts about the character and nothing internal. You're probably not going to be writing in it. People rarely do because it's kind of the subjective parts of narrative that generally make narrative interesting. So then let's look at third person omniscient. I'm definitely not the expert on third person omniscient. I've never actually written in it, but you know, I've talked about it in classes and stuff, so let's take a look at it. If you want to know more about third person omniscient, I did do a video on it for Readsy. I'll leave a link to that in the cards. It's not very long, but it is just like an intro to third omniscient and how it can be used. I did struggle a little bit with how I was going to show this in a diagram, but essentially the entire cast is within the narrator. The narrator has access to everyone in the world. Now with third omniscient, you usually have a little more distance between characters and narrator, and that's kind of for a few reasons. First of all, oftentimes the narrator is more characterized. So in a third person limited, the narrator is the character, just separated, so not coming distinctly from their voice box. But the narrator is still the character. However, with omniscient, a lot of the time, the narrator is their own character. Sometimes it's like in The Book Thief, like I was talking about earlier, where we actually distinctly know who the narrator is. The narrator is Death. Sometimes it's less, like there isn't really a clear persona, but we still kind of feel like there's a presence there. A great example of this, I don't have the book with me because I lent it to my mom, is Bel Canto by Anne Patchett. That's a really great example of an omniscient point of view. The narrator has a distinct voice and we kind of feel like there's a character there. We just don't really have a name or a face or a presence to them. I really like omniscient narratives that characterize the narrator. I think it's a really cool technique. It's not necessary, but I think it's cool. And the other reason why you generally are a little farther out is because you're going to be switching very rapidly. You can literally in omniscient change whose point of view you're in on the sentence to sentence basis. And so if you were to be extremely close and then jump extremely close to another character in the next sentence, it would be really jarring. Omniscient is generally a little farther out from the characters, but it kind of compensates that by giving you intimacy with the narrator themselves. It's like coming straight from the voice of God, God being the narrator in this case, because as writers we all want power trips and we just want to be deities of our own little worlds. Now let's take a look at third limited. It's like a spectrum and you have infinite possibilities of how close or far your psychic distance can be along the spectrum. I'm kind of just going to highlight a few to show you the difference, but it's not like you have 5 options. You have infinite options of how close your psychic distance can be. Here we have a distant third limited. So as you can see, there is some overlap between narrator and character, but it's not that much. So here the narrative is still quite objective and we don't have that much access to the character's thoughts. So this is a third person that we do have access to the character's thoughts, but maybe they don't seep through that often and the narrative doesn't feel that intimate. I think a lot of the time when narratives are written this way, it's not done purposefully and it's just done by writers who maybe are accidentally pulling out their point of view, and it often comes from withholding of not letting enough of the character color the narrative. So now let's look at a close third person. So in a close third person, as you can see in this diagram, there is still separation between the narrator and the character. The narrator is still kind of functioning as like a crutch to help the character tell the story, but the narrative is still very close to the character. So there is still some separation, but it's not that much, and it's gonna feel pretty close, and we're probably gonna feel relatively close to the character, if not almost as close as we would feel in first person, even though there's technically some separation. So here you might have a narrator who doesn't use exactly all the same language and exact thought patterns that your character would use, but it's fairly close. We're gonna get the character's emotions, we're gonna get their judgments, and we're gonna get those things relatively constantly. This is kind of where I would say, you know, most standard third-person stories find themselves. It's pretty close. It's not first-person close, but if done well, it can feel first-person close. If we were going back to that initial example, this is kind of the space around Sal hated the rain, but his dog didn't seem to care, and damn how he hated this weather. This is kind of where you're going to be floating around in this kind of point of view. Now let's look at an extremely close third person. So as you can see here, there is still a tiny sliver of separation, but they're almost the same. This is kind of first person in third person, and it's often known as free and direct narration. And a lot of the time this could mean a stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness is essentially like brain download, so it's just direct thought coming straight from the character's brain. It's extremely psychically close. Free and direct narration can be super fun. It's basically like first person in third person. It can be really, really voicey, especially if you have a character that lends itself to being really, really voicey. This can be interesting. It can be hard to maintain, but such a close third person can be kind of a fun technique. That's kind of my intro to psychic distance. If this is a new thing for you, I'd recommend when you start reading, trying to pay attention to it, you know? Ask yourself how close the psychic distance is. If you look at a paragraph and see what sentences are close and what sentences are a bit farther, start to study it in what you read, and it'll make it easier to apply and control within what you write. Because really, the most important thing with psychic distance isn't where you are, but it's that you know how to control it and that you are where you want to be. That's basically everything I wanted to say on psychic distance. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.